Now, overnight at that ASEAN conference where Prime Minister Scott Morrison was on the sidelines meeting with the regional leaders, as we talked about yesterday, the big story was a regional trade pact, RCEP as it's called, and it's going to cover something like a third of the world's trading nations. We were waiting yesterday on whether India was going to join. Well, they've held off as expected, but China's in there. US isn't in there too. It is big news. We haven't had a chance to talk about it now, but somebody who knows all about trade is a former ambassador to GATT many years ago. He's joining me now, trade expert Alan Oxley in our Sydney City studio. Welcome, Alan.
Hi, Jeanette. How are you?
Good. Can you just explain to us, I love this, we had the TPP, then we've got another one. This is RCEP, as it's called. Can you explain what it is, why it's important?
This one's important because it includes most of the Asian economies in the East Asian area. As was reported, India was a problem, and India's main problem is that it can't actually control its trade. Most member states in the Indian government are actually controlled by state governments, not the central government. So one never knew quite how India was going to cope, but it's stepped aside, which has made it easier for the rest. Now, the rest of the groups comprise all the ASEAN economies, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, China, and missed one other. But the thing is that this is an important agreement in one respect, but it's going to be some time before we see the real benefits for some time, because many of the commitments made are still quite small. And many of the smaller economies, particularly ASEAN economies, for a long time have been really reluctant to cut their tariffs significantly, and more importantly, not to actually open up their markets for investment, which is extremely important. And that today is one of the bigger drivers in growth. And that's really one of the big challenges facing the ASEAN economies.
OK, what does it mean for Australia, given that we already have a number of free trade agreements with a number of the countries there? What is the benefit for Australia? Because Scott Morrison was really talking it up for jobs yesterday. Yeah,
no, the principal benefit for us is engagement, is in being part of it. We've got a more open economy than most of the ASEAN states. We have to work patiently so that they open their markets. So for us, I think the commitment that is important is that these states now have decided they're going to come together and start to build some more open markets. So for us, there won't be a big surge. The reality with Australia, in fact, is that we're actually a relatively small trader globally, and don't trade export across the board, but politically it's extremely important for us given the fact that we're in the middle of the region.
OK, I want to compare this to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I followed for many years. That was as important strategically as it was economically. The point of the TPP was pretty well to keep China out and to have a grouping of everyone else to strengthen the anti-China forces, I would say, in the Asia-Pacific region. Donald Trump pulled them out of it. That was it. Now we have an agreement with China. The US isn't there. From a strategic point of view, is this a win for China's ascendancy?
No, I don't think so. The issue with China is significant. We know that there's been a big tussle between the US and China and trade. In fact, I think probably what's a bit more important than the announcement that this agreement's going to go ahead, and we need to be aware that it's going to be nearly 12 months before we see all those countries actually sign up. When we come to the TPP, what we found there was the commitments to open markets were much deeper and much more significant, with the US in the end stepping aside because President Trump took them out. But there's a strong sense around the place that when and if Trump's period concludes, there will be a push inside the United States to bring them back into the TPP agreement, because the range of issues that it covers and the liberal elements that are argued in it are actually more significant and will deliver a bigger result in a shorter time than we'll see with the other agreement.
So are you saying we might end up with two Asian-Pacific, Asia regional agreements, this one we've just seen, RCEP with China, and another one perhaps post-Trump with America in, maybe not China, or
yes.
Would they? So they'd be two competing, they wouldn't all get together?
No, they wouldn't all get together. And I mean, the big difference is the preparedness in the TPP, which the United States was backing, to move into the new areas for growth, like electronic commerce, investment. These are areas which are not covered in the other trade agreements, and yet these are the areas where future growth will be significant. So in the long run, Those who have been involved with the negotiations are sitting waiting with their fingers crossed. They know the US Congress parked the commitments to enter the TPP agreement and has put them aside and say, well, let's wait and see. And what they'll be waiting to see is when Trump goes, and then to see if they can then bring their interest back into it again, because the economic interests in that agreement are much more significant than what's available in the other agreement, which really is a matter of slow, steady growth, broadening of actions in that area, but nothing like the standards that will be set, I should say, in the TPP.
OK, well, let's talk about the here and now. We keep hearing that there is a resolution to the US-China trade war, as it's being called. The war, I guess you could argue, that the US pretty well started and is now showing they've got a victory. But there's talk it could happen any time soon. Where do you see the US-China trade war? Who look like going to be the winners, and how quickly will we see it? What's it mean for Australia?
Yeah, well, it's more of a trade tussle than a trade war. I mean, I know trade war gives some colour.
We love the headline. We love the headline. He called it a war. The president called it a war.
Oh, he would. But the circumstances we have now are that there's been a very quiet movement and a return of discussions and engagement between Beijing and Washington over how to proceed. And just by the way in which the president's running, he's now declaring that they will settle this agreement. It's going to be finalised quite soon, and that they'll cover about 60% of the items that the United States said wanted originally covered in the original negotiations with China. And China itself stepped back, and now it's decided it needs to engage in this. So what we'll start to see is I think a significant negotiation between the two, which will have some important consequences.
Well, we know that this has been a dark cloud over the world economy, this trade war or trade skirmish between China and the US, and it would be obviously good for markets, good for President Trump's re-election chances if everything settled down. Again, given that it was a sort of something that was created, will this agreement actually do much or just bring us back to where we were? Or will there be some real gains for the US, for the West, out of this?
No, the US will get some real gains. And there's been a very interesting tussle between the two. I think it's interesting to reflect back on how President Trump works. If you recall, when he came to office, he said, we're going to close down all these agreements, we're not going to do anything more like this. And then actually, we do look to see what he's actually done. He's actually improved some of the agreements. Some of the things he does are not welcome. He's not a pure free marketer. But on the other hand, for example, the agreement that he's now set up with Mexico and Canada and the US shows that, in fact, despite all the bluster and talk, he actually is producing results. Now, some sides to what he does are not desirable. There's certain features in trade he doesn't pay any attention to, I understand. One of them is services, which he simply neglected, and services are really important as an area of growth trade in the future. As well, he's got this idea in his head that you have a trade relationship with the United States, the US has to be in surplus. Well, that's also bad economics, but it's not quite as bad as we all thought. So the tussle with China became a trade war in a sense, but what's actually being developed now will be an amicable arrangement which will cover some of the issues in dispute, and Trump has said that we'll leave this to run on afterwards. So if we look back at when he began this process, which was December last year, he basically set about to produce a result which would produce something which would have positive effects, and it looks like we're about to see that. So with Trump, you have to separate the noise and the shouting from, at the end of the day, what the result's really going to be.
OK, and how imminent do you think we'll get some announcement on that? I mean, there's talk in the next week or so. It could be that early.
Yes, they are talking in that sense. He's basically saying we're now ready to roll on this. We've got a settlement on 60% of the issues that we were talking about. Some of them are quite legitimate. I mean, he pressed the Chinese for requiring, when products were imported and had significant IT, the Chinese demanded the IT be taken and handed over to them. And he basically said that's unacceptable, which the Chinese have quietly gone along with. And there's been several areas like this. And of course, he's still holding out the threats of imposing much greater tariffs in relationship in other trade areas. But what we see when we see these things with him, there's a huge amount of pressure and setting out high targets, and then when the moment comes, you'll actually see something softer and a bit more practical. We need to wait to see how things will run. The Chinese are in a fairly difficult position at this point in time. And in fact, the US isn't going to be that much brighter in the near future either, because growth in both economies is starting to slow.
And all that, what's it mean for Australia? I mean, we've kept up our free trade credentials, we've kept up staying close to our major trading partner in China, but what does this look like from the Australian perspective, what we've seen the Prime Minister negotiate?
Well, the reality is that with the United States, our investment relationships are far more important than the trade relationships. And our major export traded product to the United States is beef. Otherwise, our bigger trading partners are, in fact, as we well know, China. And the exports to China of iron ore and coal are very big, and now account for about 25% of our imports. The reality for us, for Australian trade, is our pattern of trade's actually quite limited. We don't manufacture a great deal of things. Our biggest trade is now increasingly in services and certainly in minerals. And I think we've been able to work within that frame quite satisfactorily, and I think very effectively. And I think for us, we haven't had to go through many of the pressures that have been put on by other countries, including the United States. The President, our Prime Minister's developed quite a good relationship with President Trump, and I think things, as far as we're concerned, are going along quite well.
OK, well, thank you very much for that excellent summary of where we stand on a day after an important trade deal. And more to come in the next few days we can get excited about. Thank you very much, Alan Oxley.
Anytime.